Good morning, everyone. So good to see you in this, our second symposium, talking about women in the biblical record and in the Christian record. It's been I don't know if I want to say dream come true, because I think we're still in the dream stage here, but this is great. And this space is so awesome to be thinking about women in the church and the biblical women. I am going to be talking about Mary Magdalene, her biblical and extra-biblical stories, talking about her today. And I would say for the two items that I think for me were most helpful as I was putting together this presentation. First is I really wanted to know more about why Mary Magdalene is drawn as a penitent sinner. What is going on with that? Because it's not part of the biblical text. You will search in vain for this picture of Mary Magdalene in the biblical text. And so I wanted to know what is going on, and after me, the presentation after me will help us think even more deeply about how Mary Magdalene is understood in the medieval and Reformation period. But I'm going to stay, since I'm a New Testament scholar, I'll be staying closer to the New Testament time. So that was one of my first questions, is why this depiction of Mary Magdalene that is so amazingly drawn by Donatello here. You'll be able to see this statue in the Visual Museum, but even before this project started, I don't know, when I was doing my just New Testament survey classes at Wheaton College, I was captivated by this picture, by this statue. Donatello's Mary, thin, exhausted, matted hair. So that's one area that we'll look at. And the second area that I wanted to look at is why women use their hair to dry feet. Yeah, okay, stay tuned. All right, more to come. So as we look today at Mary Magdalene, I thought, okay, who is she? Is she the penitent sinner here that we see in Donatello's amazing artwork? Were demons cast out of her? Was she a benefactor of Jesus' ministry? Was she a preacher? Was she a hermit? Was she a miracle worker? And the last choice, what would that be? G or H? All of the above? You could pick all of the above. As you know, in taking tests, that's often the one you want to. None of them or all of them. That's often a good choice. There's a new book out by Diane Apostolos Capadonna, just came out last year, and I felt that in her work, she tries to lay out for us the mystery, if you will, of Magdalene. And she writes, as you can see here on the slide, Mary Magdalene is sinner, penitent, witness, contemplative, anointer, reader, preacher, and more. And yet, she's also a saint. She goes on to say she has been portrayed as a glamour girl, a weeper, a matron, a protectress, a contemplative, and a hag. One of the things that we have in the English language, a word that, an adjective in our English language is related to Mary Magdalene. That word maudlin, when you describe someone as maudlin, it initially referred to someone from Magdala, but because during the medieval period, Mary Magdalene was often pictured as weeping at the cross, she became associated with this weeping, this sorrowful emotion. And that was then extended to someone who was almost drunk-like in their sorrowful emotions. So who is this Mary Magdalene? Well, as we look at our visual record, one of the more famous, you might know this picture. It's a picture trying to describe the meeting of Jesus first time with Mary Magdalene. It assumes that, that she is somehow sinful. She is hidden. You can see in the shadow. She doesn't directly look at Jesus. She has sumptuous clothing, lavish jewelry, but she's kind of hiding herself in the shade. And she's with reprobates, jeering at Jesus. Very much a picture of contrast, and I think this is the typical picture that we have of Mary Magdalene, that she is the sinner who is confronted by Jesus. But really, the first time that they meet is Luke chapter 8, 1 through 3, and all we hear there is that Jesus cast out 7 demons. And she's listed with several other women who financially support Jesus. But this picture is often how she is seen. So a lot added to that brief reference in Luke. Then we find Mary also mentioned at the crucifixion. We know that she is there with Mary, Jesus' mother. Here you see her clinging to the cross. The author who I mentioned just earlier in her new book, Apostolos Cappadona, she suggests that we have Mary Magdalene here functioning as intercessor, because Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Theotokos, has collapsed in grief. It almost appears, and Jasmine, who's our art expert, will be able to correct any of the mistakes. I feel really confident doing this now and then having Jasmine follow me, because she'll correct any of my mistakes about art. But it looks like Mary Magdalene, in a sense, is almost holding up the cross. Yeah. Well, we know from the biblical text that Mary Magdalene is at the crucifixion. And although there's not a lot of discussion of taking Jesus off the cross, we also find Mary Magdalene as one of those who would have stood at the distance as Jesus was on the cross, and presumably then helped have his body come off the cross. It's a very popular topic in art. Perhaps the most famous is Michelangelo's Pietà in St. Peter's Basilica, but it is, both in painting and sculpture, a much depicted moment in the life of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene is there. And then one of, to me, a very compelling picture by Savoldo is Mary depicted as just before she meets Jesus. This is from John chapter 20, and she's searching for the tomb. She's turning because she hears a voice. Notice that the sunrise is at the horizon, but most of the light is actually coming from behind her. That is where Jesus is standing. And so Jesus is actually present in this picture as light. To me, one of the most poignant moments in all of Scripture is when Jesus calls her name, Mary, and she recognizes who he is. I just feel that's such a rich theological and I think representative moment, that we will know who we truly are when the Lord says our name in all of its fullness and individuality. And so the author has captured this, I think, with light, emphasizing light. And we know that Mary wants to worship him, and so we have this in Latin, noli me tangere, do not touch me not, or do not hold on to me, as a signature moment in the resurrection accounts. And Jesus here says to Mary, I need to ascend to my Father and to your Father, right? I'm going, but you go to tell the other apostles that I have risen. And it's from this scene that Mary becomes known as the apostle to the apostles, the one sent to the apostles. So although she's not called apostle to the apostles as a title in the biblical text, it's a legitimate way of thinking about her because of the command that God gave her, Jesus gave her, to tell the others that he is risen. But there's a lot of other things that happen when we try to study who Mary Magdalene is, and Mary Magdalene becomes conflated with other people in the biblical text. So here we have Caravaggio, and in this painting, he is presenting Mary as, again, very well dressed, but kind of slumped. He is trying to convey here a turning point in her life. That she has up to this point been a wealthy, so presumably successful courtesan, prostitute, but he presents her as emotionally exhausted, as not at the end of her rope, let's say, not able to go on. You can see the alabaster, a jar at the bottom near where her pearls are. It's a very compelling, in my mind, a very compelling picture that captures a moment. But I don't think it's a biblical moment. Mary Magdalene is first mentioned by name in Luke chapter 8, but she is often identified with the sinful woman in Luke chapter 7. And that's where things begin to go off the rails. In this painting, which was quite made quite a stir, I guess I would say. This is a later painting, and do I have no, I don't have the date. 1891, Jean Berard did this painting, and the reason it was so captivating and challenging is because, as you can see, Jesus is the only one who is in costume. Everyone else is dressed as they would have been dressed at the time. And this is a challenge to the modern culture of that time when you would have, well, most of these men, the end of the 19th century in France, would have had, in addition to being married, would have had mistresses. And so the painter here is trying to highlight the men's hypocrisy. And you can see even the maid, if you look just right here, even the maid is a bit surprised at this. But there's Mary Magdalene, who is in a posture of grief, although her hair is up. Her hair is not hanging down. The focus here is on human suffering, raw human suffering, as exhibited by Mary Magdalene. But actually, this is not really her. There is an amazingly tenacious conviction, I guess, that is clung to in New Testament studies, that this Mary Magdalene, and in popular, this Mary Magdalene is also the sinner. This is a trope that is not just Mary Magdalene, although she's perhaps the best known, but permeates the stories about women throughout church history. And it's one we need to be really alert to, because it's almost like a default that there's going to be sexual sin in a woman's past that will need forgiveness. But for Mary, it's like she's perpetually like this, or perpetually like Donatella has drawn her, and never able to receive full forgiveness. So she becomes a symbol of how bad a human can get. But she's not, in my experience, there's not really a full reckoning that she's completely forgiven and she starts back whole and pure. And it's worth, I think, pondering why that trope clings so tightly in the Christian narrative. It makes me mad, it irritates me. So that'll come out a little bit too, as the morning coffee wears off and I get even more agitated. So I want to talk a little bit about how we get to where we are here with Mary Magdalene. At least according to Apostolos, Cappadonna, she will argue that Magdala doesn't mean tower. So apologies to our script this morning. But it is the case that Magdala had a reputation of being depraved at this time. You see Josephus, Jewish historian, and also Pliny, Gentile. And both of them argued that Magdala was depraved. It was a trade town, and so as you have that kind of interaction, you will have all sorts in the town. But I don't think we want to overstate this. Lots of cities were depraved. There was depravity. But the 7 demons that were cast out of Mary, that's mentioned in Luke 8, those demons are understood to be sexual demons of some sort. I don't know that they really sketched out exactly what that would be, but it was this idea of sexual sin. And so that's where you start to get this idea that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. I think also because it says in Luke 8 that she gave money, as she was one of the benefactors, and there has been for a long time the sense within New Testament studies that women couldn't do legitimate work outside the home, so they either were born wealthy or they gained their wealth through ill-gotten gains through immoral means. And that's simply not the case. There were many women who had small shops or were business women. Not that there was a middle class at this time, but women could legitimately work and have extra resources. It's Tertullian, who we all love to hate, who first mentioned Mary Magdalene and the adulterous woman, which is in John. I haven't mentioned her yet, but in John. And then also the sinful woman in Luke 7. And then connecting it with Mary of Bethany. How do we get all of those? Well, Mary of Bethany in John 12, she also anoints Jesus' feet. So you have this connection of anointing feet and hair. In Matthew and Mark, we have an unnamed woman who is at Simon the leper's house just before Jesus experiences his passion. And this unnamed woman in Matthew and Mark pours perfume on Jesus' head using an alabaster jar. Luke has a story where a woman who's identified as a sinful woman, not as a prostitute. Luke does use the word prostitute later when he tells the story of the prodigal son. But here in Luke 7, it's a sinful woman who comes. She has an alabaster jar. She uses that on Jesus' feet after she has cried and her tears have washed Jesus' feet. John, in the Gospel of John, has this similar story to Matthew and Mark, but identifies the woman as Mary of Bethany, who anoints Jesus' feet. So these various stories get pulled together by Tertullian, who then says we've got Mary Magdalene, who is the same as Mary of Bethany, who is the same as a sinful woman in Luke 7, who's also connected with John 8 and the adulterous woman. Only women anoint Jesus in the Gospels. And only women are depicted as washing feet, except, of course, for John 13. So Jerome, a little bit later, Jerome lives around 340 to 420. He argues against Tertullian here. He thinks John 8 and Luke 7 are different women. And I thought I would mention this, that not everyone at this time views the women as Tertullian did. Origen of Alexandria, for example, he sees Mary Magdalene rightly as the first witness to the resurrection. She's a faithful disciple. He doesn't see her as the one who anoints. But Gregory the Great, in his homily, combines all of the texts. He follows Tertullian here. He says the exorcism of the 7 demons are driving out these sinful, promiscuous acts. Interestingly, in a later homily, Gregory the Great disparages Mary Magdalene's immediate faith in the resurrection that we have in the biblical text. He disparages that, and he instead points to Thomas, the one who doubts, as more representative of our own lack of faith and someone we can relate to. I mention that because I think Gregory the Great states what is often implicit, which is that Mary Magdalene, with her sinful past, locked into this constant cycle of penitence, which can never fully work. You know, she's constantly on the rinse cycle, but it's never clean. Makes it really hard for us to want to be her at times, right? And you certainly don't want your daughters growing up to be Mary Magdalene. But somehow doubting Thomas, he's not sinful, he's doubting. And he eventually, when Jesus speaks to him again, believes. Whereas Mary Magdalene, whose faith is so strong, she's willing to speak this to the apostles, and Jesus believes that she has that strong faith and will do it. We can't use her as a role model. And so while Gregory the Great is very overt in this, I think we do it today a lot. And so for us today, she's not a model. And that's very sad, because she can be. I want to pause or go back to, just for a moment, the foot washing. Because this was what was kind of driving me nuts a little bit recently is the whole thing about having the hair down. And, hairstyles are a big thing. If you live in the New Testament, you just got hairstyles that, I don't know. There's even, people in this room who've written books on that. Hairstyles and women and should they speak in church and all that good stuff. Anyway, we'll hear more about that later. But the idea that this sinful woman letting her hair down is indicative of being a prostitute has bothered me because I think, well, what do you do with Mary of Bethany? She's not, what she has done will be remembered, right? Whenever the gospel is told, it will be remembered. So there's just a lot of dissonance in this. What's going on? So I was looking for information, and a scholar that I was looking at, Charles Cosgrove, who was at Northern Seminary for a while, and then just recently retired from Garrett Theological Seminary, also in Chicago. He was talking about hairstyles in the ancient world, and noted, as does Apostolos Cappadonna, that young unmarried women wore their hair down as a sign of innocence. Unmarried girls, Roman girls, wore their hair unbound. We see this in a couple of texts. Ovid, for example, mentions maybe they just have a headband. Prostitutes, on the other hand, often braided their hair, had it up maybe with fancy jewels or flowers. So in this sense, Mary Magdalene looks more like how even a prostitute in the ancient world might look. Matrons, married women, absolutely put their hair up, and they could also cover it. But here's the exception: grieving. We have Plutarch, even in his Moralia 267, talks about how when sons and daughters go to the gravesides of their parents, the daughters let their hair flow down. Cosgrove also mentions Perpetua, in Perpetua's story, when she's in the arena and she gets knocked down and her dress is torn, and she, for modesty's sake, she covers her thigh. But just before she does that, she pins her hair back up. She doesn't want anyone to think she's mourning. It has nothing to do with modesty. It's about mourning. This is her day of triumph. And so her hair must be up because she's not mourning. Related to mourning is an expression of great gratitude or veneration to the gods or goddesses in the Gentiles. And in the sinner case of Luke 7, you have a woman who has been forgiven much. And so the grief of the past sin, coupled with the veneration and appreciation of the mercy and grace given, explain her hair being down. And I think another point made in this, think of Simon's comment. If he were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman she is. Okay. That implies that her actions of the unbound hair, wiping up the wet feet, did not signal prostitute. Because it wouldn't take a prophet to notice. Everybody would notice. It would be totally on the surface. For Simon, for his words to make sense, she had to look average, normal, and doing something that would be expected in a given context. And we know what that context was. She, through her faith, received forgiveness and is honoring Jesus. Yeah. So, one mystery solved. Why the hair down? What about these extra biblical accounts? In this altarpiece that we have here, let me give you a little background here. We have, of course, Mary sitting on a white throne with the alabaster jar. You're just going to see the alabaster jar everywhere, and just, put an asterisk next to it so that you know it looks lovely and it's not biblical. Okay. But in this beautiful altarpiece, you have on the top left the sign, or the story of Luke 7, and then below that, John 20, that's the biblical piece. Obviously, right above Mary in the center there is Mary at the cross. Yes, biblical. And then when you come to the right side, you have a story about Mary when she lived at the end of her life in France. And I'll talk about that in a minute. It's one of the legends that has followed Mary. And then the bottom is when Mary dies and Jesus receives her soul. But before we get to that, I'd like to talk about Mary and a story of another Mary, Mary of Egypt. That helps us understand the penitent Mary picture here. Pull that. There we go. We have a tradition of a woman by the name of Mary of Egypt. And in this story, this will not shock you, she is depicted as having a huge sexual appetite, because all women at this time who made it to the saints started that way. She was in Alexandria and then later moved to Jerusalem, and she had a conversion near the Holy Sepulchre. She heard a voice telling her, "Go across the Jordan." And so she did. She had 3 loaves of bread with her, and she went out to live in the wilderness, and her clothes wore out. She was there for years, and she just gathered food, or mysteriously she was fed, like miraculously. It's not entirely, it was either one of those. Her clothes wore out, but her hair kept growing. So this is where you get the picture of Mary Magdalene with all of her hair long and being a penitent. It comes from the blending together of the story of Mary Magdalene and Mary of Egypt. We know about this story from Saint Sophrosyne, who was the patriarch of Jerusalem in 634. Her story is told to Saint Zosimas of Palestine. He was a monk. He met her in the desert, and he gives her his cloak, his mantle, because she just has her hair there. She asks that he return the next year on Maundy, Thursday, that she might receive communion. So he does that. He comes there to the edge of the Jordan. She's on the other side. She sees him. Of course, she just walks right across the water, walks on the water to him. He gives her communion, and then he's ready to leave, and she asks him, "Would you return again next year?" Which he agrees. So he comes again the next year, and he finds her dead body. And there's an inscription in the sand which indicates to him that she passed away right after she received the communion. Now, he's trying to figure out how he's going to bury her. And as luck or providence would have it, a friendly lion comes by and helps dig a hole so she can be buried there. I mention this story because bits of it also are in another story about Mary Magdalene called The Golden Legend, which we'll come to in a minute. But before we get there, there's another story about Mary Magdalene, and that is that she preached before the Emperor Tiberius. And you see here a picture of the Russian Orthodox Church of St. Mary Magdalene there on the Mount of Olives. And I'll give you a close-up then. This is the big picture inside, and here's a close-up of it. She travels to Rome, it is said, after the resurrection. She preached, she helped the church there, and she's invited to a banquet where Tiberius attends. And she preached to the emperor. And the emperor was told by Mary Magdalene how awful Pilate did his job at the trial of Jesus. She confirmed the resurrection. She said, I saw it with my own eyes. And she held up an egg as a symbol of new life. So Tiberius said, well, he'd believe in the resurrection if that egg turned red. Well, there you go. This is, Mary Magdalene then said, Christos anesti, which is Christ is risen. And this phrase continues down through the church today. But she is to have spoken that to the emperor. The visit to Rome is supported by some who say in Romans 16, verse 6, that Paul was referring to Mary when he said, greet Mary who has worked among you. Okay? So that's how that is connected. After this event, she returns to Jerusalem. Then she travels with John the disciple and Mary Theotokos, Jesus' mother. The three go to Ephesus, and that's where Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, live. You can see this in modern-day Turkey, outside of the ancient city of Ephesus, about 5 miles. It is said that she helped John write his gospel, and also that she wrote her own. And so from that little note, the medieval depictions of Mary often have her depicted as an author, going back to these. She is said to have been buried here. There's a cave that has another legend of these that's called the Seven Sleeper Saints. They were running from persecution, went into the cave, and then it was miraculously sealed, and they were awakened much later, safe. So, Catholics have Mary Magdalene's relics at St. John Lateran, although the Orthodox say that her remains are in the Monastery of Lazarus on the Bosporus back in Constantinople. Some maybe are even in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or in this church on the Mount of Olives. Or maybe she's buried in Le Sambuum in France. Okay. The legend, the golden legend, pulling together Mary of Egypt and Mary Magdalene. These are pictures that I took when we were at Assisi a year and a half ago or so on a phenomenal trip that I got to go on, and that was led by Dr. Sandra Glahn. It was so good, we're doing it again. There'll be more info, but I know you're all excited, and you want to be a part of it, and you can be a part of it, and you'll hear more about it. So this is a teaser. Kelly has it all arranged. Anyway, here we are, phenomenal site. When you go in, there is a chapel that, and these are not these are taken off the web, but we have some of, in our museum, eventually we will have these up if they're not up already on our site. Here, with this chapel, it depicts, and this is Giotto's art, it depicts these scenes in Mary's life. And when I went into this space, because you know I love Mary Magdalene, it was hard for me to even leave. I don't know how long I spent in this space. It is gorgeous, but it also just allowed me to think even more deeply about this incredible disciple and how her faithfulness was added to, stories were added, but made her such an important part of medieval piety. And I know others will be talking more about that medieval piety later. So we have the Mary Magdalene this golden legend that describes how she after all the events that we know of in the biblical text, she then travels to Marseille in France, and she meets the prince there, and she has a time of solitude, about 30 years or so, and then she dies there. And there are post-death miracles that she experiences. She also, so I'll get some pictures up here. In the very top of the screen, it is said that every day she would be taken up on the particular liturgical hours. She would be taken up to heaven. So there you see her with the angels. And then she also, well, here you see the biblical scene of do not hold on to me. But then on the other side, you see a story from the traditions that built up around her, where when they arrive at Marseille with one thing and another, she's able to pray, and this royal couple conceive and are ready to have their child. She's going back, I think, to Rome. And the father wants to go. The mother says, or the pregnant wife, I want to come with you. No, you're with child. You should stay here. No, I'm going to go with you. Anyway, they have a storm, and she dies. And they put her on a rocky island. And the child is born, but is going to die also because the mom has died. And then they continue on their way. When they go back from this pilgrimage, they pass by this island, and as you can imagine, you're probably guessing this is a happy ending. They actually arrive, and the child is alive, and so is the mother, because of Mary's prayers. So this becomes a very important story in the life of Mary Magdalene. And this is the bishop who wanted the, oh no, I'm not sure now. I was going to say who, I think who commissioned it, because there's also, the monk that I mentioned with the story of Mary in Egypt also factors in this case. Yeah. Here we have a remember that they connected Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany. So this scene is from the raising of Lazarus, which is a biblical scene, but here the two Marys have been conflated. Although she is still in France here, this is still part of that story that happens in France, you really see the story of Mary of Egypt blended here, where the monk gives her his cloak. But she lives as a hermit and daily is lifted up to heaven. In this story, she preaches to those in Marseille. And this is part of the altarpiece we saw earlier. This is a depiction of Mary preaching. And so this is the last slide. Just thought I would hold that up for us. And I'm happy to take any of your questions. We have a few minutes, I think, for questions. And I can go back if you wanted to see another picture. Yes, Christine. Mm-hmm.
Is that simply because she was a woman, or because of all the other demon stories, Jesus casting out demons from men?
I think the identifying that she has demons, I think they jump to the sexual nature because they've already decided that she is the woman that's identified as sinful in chapter 7, just before that. Correct, it's inaccurate. Correct. Yes. Yeah.
In Marseille, when she's living as a hermit, but also preaching?
When she arrived at the city, she was preaching along with this group that came. They were preaching, and they weren't terribly persecuted, but they were marginalized. And eventually she's able to talk with the rulers there. And that when that couple conceives, the Christians are not as persecuted anymore. But thank you for that.
It would seem contrary as one of Jesus' followers to just go into hiding and not be preaching.
Yeah. And her, and I think Grace and Jasmine both will be able to help us in terms of medieval piety. And I don't know, George, if you'll be getting to that either. The idea of being on your own and praying is, I think, conceived of in a much more active sense. You actually really are contributing to society in a way that evangelical Protestants, and I know you know this, but I mean, that we value speaking the word in ways that throughout church history, it hasn't always been that way. There have been other examples. Yeah, Christian.
I have an underdeveloped question.
Awesome. It'll be an underdeveloped answer.
So
history of women who pledged their virginity and then all of a sudden were like, you're gonna marry this dude, or you're like, come get it. What are the implications for the reduction of women to their sexuality, to their proximity to men in a sexual way? From the biblical text, from history, from depiction in art, what are the implications for that for like modern hermeneutic?
Yeah, well, this is why I think I just get so frustrated with the depiction of Mary Magdalene and also the Samaritan woman, both of whom, with I think very little evidence, are seen as grossly sexually immoral, which for women is that, in terms of our society, like an unforgivable. You never get fully clean. It's like the results of my laundry. Once you get a stain, it will never fully come out if I'm doing the laundry. Unlike for men, let's say King David, he can still be, and I'm happy for this, that he can be seen as a man after God's own heart, after confessing and repenting to the gross sins which led to adultery and murder. But a woman can't, in the minds of society, not in God's mind, but in the society, just can't step out of that. And that is why I think it is so important for good exegesis to happen, so that we can pull her out of, for those women that are wrongly labeled, we can pull them out. It still is very important also for those who have had that experiences, like the saints that we spoke of, who, okay, you had to marry this guy, even though he wasn't a Christian and you wanted to have a virginal life. We also have to educate in that way that the sexual modesty is not the sum total of a woman's identity. So I think what you're identifying are two very important issues that we've got to address both. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, Kelly.
So one story has her in France.
Mm-hmm.
One story has her in France.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any evidence? I guess I'm thinking historically, or are these legends only? Is it possible that there's parts of it?
I think the strongest would be Ephesus, because that's a pretty strong tradition that John and Mary Theotokos went there. So I think that would be stronger, I think. Yep. I can't imagine her presenting to Tiberius, or really any Christian. Tiberius could potentially be weirder than Nero. So, yeah, we're in polite company here, so we're not going to go there. Yeah.
I had read some, and I can't remember where, some stories about Mary and Martha going to France, and I'm wondering if that is also completed in this.
Potentially, yeah. I don't know if that's in the Golden Legend. Do you know? Yeah, I don't know. But it's very possible, because if Mary Magdalene is also Mary of Bethany and Mary Bethany's sister is Martha, then they could go, you know what, I probably didn't take good enough notes on that detail. Maybe in the Golden Legend she is mentioned that way. Yeah. Anyway, that would fit, broadly speaking, the way that the data from the biblical text is conflated. And did you have a follow-up with that then, or? I know.
How do we read that and pick it apart and follow the trails when it's...
I think first you take a moment of despair. Then you pick yourself up and you say, okay, see if we can make some sense of this. It's annoying that they just chose the same name over and over again, like popular that way. But I think that from a exegesis standpoint, or from reading hermeneutically, I think if you come into it thinking each story could be about an individual woman, that would be a good place to start. Because in a sense, what Gregory the Great did was just wipe out two other individuals in conflating everybody. And to me, there is a I don't know if sexism is too strong of a word with that, but there's just kind of an assumption that you can go ahead and blend them all together. And I don't see the church doing that with men. Now, granted, there's not potentially as much overlap with the names, but the stories of in John and Matthew and Mark, with the Passion versus Luke, happening at a different time. On the other hand, Luke's story has a lot of differences, like significant differences. But this idea that there's so few women, I guess some of the assumptions behind this conflating is there are not a lot of women, they aren't doing that much anyway, and they're all basically the same. And so if instead you start with these are separate, discrete stories that help us understand discipleship better. The new book, Women Who Do, is it Carrie that's with, just a phenomenal book. And as she looked at discipleship in the Gospels, she realized so often women are the ones who do. They are the faithful ones. If you want a picture of faithful discipleship, we've got stories. It's just that the central character is female. And so it kind of, it doesn't, it's like a Gregory the Great, in his homily, 28 or 29. Look to Thomas. He doubts. We can relate to that. Not Mary Magdalene and her immediate faith. You think, oh, my word. Yeah. Yes.
So I love the idea of using art to help us understand the biblical story. I mean, obviously, we have it in art. But I was curious about the linear progression of the art as we understand Mary to be a sinner and a woman who's promiscuous to a woman who ends up becoming a preacher. And I'm wondering, does the art, and I wasn't paying attention to the dates, that's my bad, does the art track with the understanding of her being, the worst of society to someone who is a penitent and an influential preacher? And does that tangentially reflect the ideas within society at large, especially within the Christian community, of how women fit into the church? And do we see the up and down, and are they in sync, or are they asynchronous?
That's such a great question. And it's timed beautifully at the top of the hour when Jasmine is going to come up. And also Grace is here as well, and there might be some other medievalists. The legend, the Golden Legend, is a medieval story, and and you're absolutely right as you're picking up what appear to be, from our standpoint, some inconsistencies in how she's understood. We may also think about it as kind of the fullness. She becomes, as Apostolos Cappadona quote at the beginning that I mentioned, she almost becomes like larger than life and is able to represent an amazing array of attributes that are respected in faithfulness. So your question is a great one, and there's people in the room that will give a better answer than me. So how's that as a segue? That's really good. I think, anyway, for me. Like, the talk might not have been good, but this segue with your question is excellent. Do we take a stretch break or just Jasmine come on up, or what would you like?
We will go on to the next presentation.
All righty.